Some betrayals don't come from enemies. They come dressed as your own parents, sitting at the Thanksgiving table. For 28 years, I played the flawless, forgotten daughter, while they worshipped my disastrous brother. When they legally signed my future away to fund his delusions, I finally rewrote the script. My name is Harper. If you had asked anyone in our leafy, upper-middle-class suburb of Oak Park who the good kid in the Davis family was, they would have pointed directly at me. I was the straight-A student, the reliable babysitter, the girl who never missed curfew and who paid for her own prom dress by working weekends at a local bakery. But if you asked my parents, Margaret and Zion, who the light of the family was, they wouldn't hesitate. It was Weston. Weston was 2 years younger than me, born with a crooked, devastatingly charming smile and an uncanny ability to turn every mistake into a story that ended with my mother laughing and my father shaking his head in fond amusement. From the very beginning, the dynamic in our household was set in stone. Weston was the fragile, brilliant artist who needed to be nurtured, and I was the sturdy, self-sufficient workhorse who could be left to my own devices. Therapists call it being a glass child, the sibling who is seen right through because all the parental energy is focused on the other, more demanding child. The disparity started small. When I was 16, I bought my own used Honda Civic with money I'd saved for 3 years. When Weston turned 16, he totaled our father's Mercedes after drinking at a senior party. My parents didn't ground him. Instead, they hired a top-tier lawyer named Sullivan to ensure the DUI was scrubbed from his record, spending upwards of $15,000. Their rationale? Weston's future is too bright to be ruined by one silly mistake, Harper. You have to understand. I did understand. I understood that my parents' love was unconditional for him, and entirely conditional on my silence and compliance. By my mid-20s, the gap had only widened. I had put myself through state college on academic scholarships, waitressing nights to cover my rent. I graduated summa cum laude and landed a grueling but well-paying job as an account manager at a logistics firm called Kit and Hayes. I lived in a cramped, drafty studio apartment, saving every penny I could. Weston, meanwhile, had dropped out of 3 different private universities. He wanted to find himself, a journey entirely funded by Margaret and Zion. He backpacked through Europe, took an intensive photography course in Florence, and briefly attempted to become a DJ in Berlin. When he finally returned home at 25, flat broke and entirely unbothered, he announced he had found his true calling. He was going to open an upscale farm-to-table restaurant. He already had the name, the Brass Lily. He had no culinary training, no business degree, and no capital. But he had Margaret and Zion. I remember the dinner where it happened. It was Thanksgiving. We were sitting around the heavy mahogany table my mother had inherited from my grandmother. The smell of roasted turkey and my mother's expensive Chanel perfume hung in the air. Weston, swirling a glass of Pinot Noir, casually mentioned that he needed investors for his restaurant. "Well, your father and I have been talking," my mother said, her eyes shining as she looked at him. "We're going to remortgage the house, sweetheart. We believe in you. We're giving you the startup capital." I stopped chewing. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're remortgaging the house that's been paid off for 10 years? It's an investment, Harper." My father, Zion, chimed in defensively, adjusting his glasses. "Weston has a brilliant business plan." "He doesn't have a business plan, Dad. He doesn't even know how to poach an egg," I argued, the resentment I'd swallowed for decades finally bubbling to the surface. 2 years ago, I asked you to co-sign a $10,000 loan, so I could put a down payment on a starter condo. You told me it was time I learned financial independence, but you're going to hand Weston hundreds of thousands of dollars." My mother's face hardened. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "You are entirely missing the point, Harper. You are strong. You have a good job. You've always been capable. Weston is sensitive. He needs a foundation to build his confidence. Why are you so jealous of your own brother? We expected better of you." I sat there, utterly silenced. They had twisted my independence into a weapon against me and painted his incompetence as a virtue that required rewarding. They handed Weston a check for $350,000. The brass lily lasted exactly 14 months. Weston hired his friends, overspent on custom-imported Italian marble countertops, and neglected to actually manage the inventory. When it collapsed, he didn't just lose my parents' money. He left behind a trail of unpaid vendors and a massive tax lien. And yet, when he moved back into his childhood bedroom, my mother made his favorite pot roast and told him how brave he was for trying. I watched from the sidelines, suffocating under the weight of their delusion, not knowing that the worst was yet to come. 5 years passed. I was 31, newly promoted to director at my firm, and I had finally managed to buy a small townhome entirely on my own. I rarely visited Oak Park. The air in my childhood home always felt thick with unspoken resentments and the lingering smell of Weston's expensive, unearned cologne. Then, my father had a heart attack. It was a mild myocardial infarction, but it was enough to scare my parents into facing their mortality. Suddenly, the word estate planning became the daily topic of conversation. My mother called me on a brisk Tuesday morning and asked me to come to the house that weekend. "We're sitting down with an attorney," she said. "We want to make sure everything is clearly outlined for you and your brother when the time comes." A small, foolish part of me felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally seen the light. Weston was 30 years old now, working sporadically as a consultant while draining whatever remained of my parents' savings. Surely, the near-death experience had shown my father the reality of their situation. Surely, this was the moment they would ensure fairness. I arrived at the house on Saturday afternoon. Weston was already there, lounging on the leather sofa, tapping away on his phone. He looked up and gave me that trademark, asymmetrical smile. "Hey, sis. Big day." Mr. Caldwell, a family lawyer my parents had known for years, sat at the dining room table with a stack of thick ivory folders. My parents sat opposite him. My father looked frail, his skin pale and slightly translucent. My mother looked tense. I took a seat next to Weston, my stomach twisting in a knot. "Thank you for coming, Harper," Mr. Caldwell began, his voice practiced and professional. "Your parents have decided to establish an irrevocable living trust to protect their assets from probate. We are finalizing the details of the beneficiaries today." "Okay," I said, folding my hands on the table. "That makes sense." "Right," my mother interrupted, leaning forward. "Harper, we want to be completely transparent with you. You know your father's health gave us a scare, and it made us realize how vulnerable Weston is right now." My jaw tightened. "Vulnerable? He has debts, Harper," my father rasped, looking down at his hands. "From the restaurant, and some other investments that didn't pan out." "So," my mother continued, her voice taking on that familiar, defensive edge, "we have decided to transfer the deed of this house, along with the remainder of our liquid assets, the mutual funds and my pension, into the trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust will be Weston. The room went dead silent. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway filled the void. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for Mr. Caldwell to correct her. But the lawyer just looked uncomfortably at his paperwork. "I'm sorry, what?" I finally whispered. "You're leaving everything to Weston? The house? The investments? Everything?" "Now, don't get hysterical," my mother snapped, already annoyed by my entirely justified reaction. "We thought about splitting it. But if we leave half to you, Weston's creditors could potentially go after his half. We have to shield the assets. Besides, look at you. You have a beautiful townhome, a 6-figure salary, stock options. You don't need our money." "This isn't about needing the money, Mum," I yelled, my voice cracking. "This is about what it represents. You are legally disinheriting me to bail out a 30-year-old man who refuses to work." "Keep your voice down," my father warned. Weston finally spoke up, looking thoroughly unbothered. "Look, Harper, it's just paperwork. It's just to keep the vultures off my back. If Mum and Dad pass, I'll make sure you get some heirlooms or whatever. But I need the house." "Vultures?" I turned to him, my marketing-trained brain picking up on the phrasing. I looked at Mr. Caldwell, who was actively avoiding my gaze. I looked back at Weston. "What vultures, Weston? The restaurant closed 4 years ago. The tax lien was settled. What are you hiding?" Weston shifted uncomfortably. My mother tried to speak, but I held up a hand. "No, I want to know. What are you actually shielding this money from?" Under pressure, Weston cracked. It wasn't a business debt. It was crypto margins and illicit gambling. Weston had borrowed over $150,000 from a shady private lending group in Chicago. People who didn't send polite collection letters. He was drowning, and my parents had decided the only way to save him was to sacrifice my entire inheritance, essentially hiding their assets behind his name in an irrevocable trust, so that if they died, the lenders couldn't force a sale of the estate. But Weston would have a free house to live in forever. "You knew about this?" I asked, looking at my parents. The horror was settling deep in my bones. "You knew he gambled away hundreds of thousands of dollars, and your solution is to give him an $800,000 house and cut me out completely." "He has an illness, Harper," my mother cried out, tears finally springing to her eyes. "He's an addict. We have to protect him. You are so cold, so vindictive. Why can't you have some compassion for your brother?" The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. For 28 years, I had been the good soldier. I had asked for nothing, expected nothing, and built a life out of the scraps of attention they occasionally tossed my way. And in the end, my reward for being responsible was being erased from their legacy entirely. I stood up slowly. The anger that had been boiling inside me suddenly evaporated, leaving behind something cold, hard, and unbreakable. "You know what?" I said quietly, looking at the three of them. "You're right, Mom. I am strong. I am independent. I don't need your money. And as of right now, I don't need your family either." "Harper, don't be dramatic," my father sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm not being dramatic, Dad. I'm being practical." I picked up my purse from the floor. "You've made your choice. You chose your son. You chose to fund his destruction rather than stand by my success. Enjoy your trust fund, Weston. I hope it keeps you warm when the money runs out." I walked out of the front door of the house I grew up in, and I didn't look back. As I started my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. "You are being incredibly selfish. We expect an apology when you calm down." I didn't reply. I blocked her number. Then I blocked my father's, and then Weston's. As I drove away from Oak Park, the tears finally came, hot and blinding. I had lost my family. They had left me with absolutely nothing. But as I merged onto the highway, heading back to the life I had built with my own 2 hands, a new thought began to take root in my mind. They hadn't left me with nothing. They had left me with absolute freedom. I was no longer the glass child waiting to be seen. I was the author of my own life now, and it was time to rewrite the story. The hardest part about walking away from your family isn't the explosive fight or the dramatic exit. It's the quiet Tuesday mornings that follow. It's the sheer, terrifying silence of realizing that the safety net you thought you had, however frayed and conditional, is completely gone. For the first 6 months after the lawyer's office, I threw myself into therapy with a brilliant, no-nonsense psychologist named Dr. Aris Thorne. Dr. Aris Mitchell. She helped me dismantle the guilt that my mother had spent decades hard-wiring into my brain. You are not responsible for catching someone who intentionally jumps off a cliff, Dr. Mitchell told me during one particularly tearful session, and you are certainly not obligated to supply the parachute they refuse to pack. I took that mantra and applied it to my career. I left my comfortable director role at Kitt & Hayes in Chicago. I packed up my townhome, sold the furniture, and moved to Austin, Texas, a city where nobody knew my name, my brother's failures, or my parents' delusions. I took a massive risk and partnered with a former client, an unapologetically sharp British expat named Chloe Bennett, to launch our own logistics consulting firm, Vanguard Supply Solutions. We started in a miserable, windowless office above a dry cleaner on East 6th Street. We worked 80-hour weeks, fueled by cheap coffee and the desperate need to prove ourselves. My drive was fueled by something darker, too: spite. Every time I felt exhausted, I remembered the smug look on Weston's face and the cold dismissal in my mother's eyes. I channeled all my unresolved anger into building an empire. It worked. Within 3 years, Vanguard landed a massive contract with a national grocery chain, followed by a lucrative partnership with a tech hardware manufacturer. By the time I turned 35, Vanguard was a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I bought a stunning, sun-drenched, modern house in the hills over Lake Austin. I had a tight-knit circle of friends I called my chosen family, and I was engaged to a wonderful, grounded structural engineer named Harrison. I was happy, truly, deeply happy. I had rewritten my story, but ghosts have a funny way of finding your new address. The call came on a sweltering August afternoon. I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly projections when my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed a number from Illinois. It was Aunt Clara, my father's older sister, who had always been a quiet, observant bystander to my parents' favoritism. "Harper," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry to bother you. I know you haven't spoken to them in years, but I didn't know who else to call." My chest tightened. "What happened, Aunt Clara? Is it Dad?" "Your father passed away, honey, 2 nights ago. Massive stroke." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "But, Harper, that's not the only reason I'm calling. It's Margaret. And the house. It's all gone." I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. "What do you mean, gone?" "The house is in an irrevocable trust for Weston." Aunt Clara let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Weston found a way. After the trust was finalized, those men he owed money to, the gambling ring, they didn't just back off. They started showing up at the house. They threatened him. They threatened your parents." The blood rushed in my ears. The vultures had finally landed in Oak Park. "Zion's health was declining," Aunt Clara explained, and Margaret was terrified. Weston convinced them that the only way to save their lives was to legally dissolve the trust. He found a shady attorney who argued undue influence or some legal loophole because your father was mentally declining. They broke the trust. Once the house was back in your parents' names, Weston had Margaret co-sign a massive cash-out refinance at a predatory interest rate. He mortgaged the house again, I whispered, feeling sick. He took out $600,000 in equity, Harper. He paid off the loan sharks and then he vanished. He took whatever was left and ran. We think he's in Costa Rica or Mexico. No one has heard from him in 8 months. And Mum? She couldn't make the payments. Zion's medical bills drained the pension. The bank foreclosed on the house last week. She's packing up right now. The sheriff is coming on Friday to change the locks. Harper, she has nothing. She has nowhere to go. I flew back to Chicago the next morning, not as a grieving daughter rushing to comfort her widowed mother, but as a woman returning to the scene of a crime to ensure the ledger was finally closed. Harrison, my fiancé, had offered to come with me, standing by the door of our Austin home with his overnight bag already packed. But I kissed his cheek and told him this was a ghost I had to face alone. The flight was a blur of turbulent clouds and cold coffee. My mind raced with Aunt Clara's words. He took the money and ran. When my rental car pulled up to the curb of my childhood home in Oak Park, the breath caught in my throat. The perfectly manicured lawn, once my father's pride and joy, was overgrown and choked with thigh-high weeds. The pristine white paint on the wraparound porch was peeling off in jagged strips like dead skin. But the most glaring detail was the bright, neon-orange foreclosure notice taped aggressively to the front door. The physical decay of the house perfectly mirrored the rot that had always existed inside it. I walked up the cracked concrete path, the sound of my heels echoing in the oppressive, humid Illinois air. I didn't bother knocking. The door was unlocked, a sign of how deeply my mother had given up. The inside smelled of dust, sour milk, and despair. The heavy mahogany furniture, the Persian rugs, the expensive art that used to line the hallway, all of it was gone, leaving pale, ghost-like rectangles on the faded wallpaper. Margaret was sitting on a taped-up cardboard box in the center of the empty living room. She looked like a hollowed-out shell of the imperious, Chanel-draped woman who had callously disinherited me 5 years ago. She had aged 20 years. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed and dyed a rich auburn, was now a brittle, unkempt grey. She wore a stained, oversized sweater, and her eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark, bruised-looking circles. She looked up, blinking as if I were a mirage. "Harper." "Hello, Mum," I said, my voice eerily calm. She burst into ragged tears and stumbled forward, trying to pull me into a hug. I took a firm, deliberate step back. The rejection hung heavily in the stale air between us. She froze, her arms dropping to her sides before she covered her face, sobbing brokenly. "He left us," she wailed, collapsing back onto the box. "He took the money and he left. Weston promised he was just making a quick transfer to secure the funds offshore. He said it was to protect us from the bank." "And you believed him," I stated. It wasn't a question. "He's my son," she cried. "Your father was so sick, Harper. Zion's stroke. It paralyzed his left side. We needed round-the-clock care. The pension was gone. The trust was broken. Weston told us the only way to afford a private nurse was to let him handle the secondary mortgage. But he forged Zion's signature to empty the remaining equity entirely. He didn't just take the house money, Harper. He drained the checking accounts. He left us with $42. I stared at her, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. "Where did Dad die, Mum?" Margaret flinched, looking away. A state-run facility in Joliet. It was awful. Smelled like bleach and urine. He died crying for Weston. He kept asking the nurses if his boy had called. Weston never even answered my texts. I know, I said, crossing my arms. Aunt Clara told me. What I want to know is why you didn't call me when Dad had the stroke. Her eyes darted to the floor. I was ashamed. And Weston said you would just gloat. He said you hated us. No, Mom, I didn't hate you. I just finally saw you clearly. I corrected her gently, but firmly. Well, you're here now, she pleaded, sudden desperate energy animating her frail frame. She grabbed the sleeve of my blazer. Aunt Clara said you're doing incredibly well. She said your company in Texas is making millions. You can pay the bank, Harper. We can stop the sheriff from coming on Friday. You can buy the house back. I can stay here, and we can fix this. I looked down at her hands, clutching my clothes. Even now, standing in the catastrophic wreckage of her own choices, she viewed me not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a utility to be exploited. A walking, talking ATM, meant to fix the mess her golden boy had created. She hadn't learned a thing. No, I said softly, prying her cold fingers off my arm one by one. Margaret froze, her eyes widening in genuine shock. No. What do you mean, no? I am your mother. I am about to be thrown out onto the street. And whose fault is that? I asked, the years of therapy with Dr. Mitchell keeping my voice perfectly steady, completely devoid of the hysteria she expected. You made a choice. 5 years ago, sitting right there. I pointed to the empty space where the dining table used to be. You looked me in the eye and told me I was entirely cut out of your legacy to protect Weston's gambling debts. You chose him. You handed an arsonist the matches, and now you are angry at me because the house burned down. He was sick. He manipulated us, she screamed, her desperation curdling into familiar venom. You were always so jealous of him. You are cold, Harper. You have a heart of ice. He didn't manipulate you. He showed you exactly who he was, over and over, and you rewarded him for it, I countered, completely unfazed by her insults. I didn't feel a shred of guilt or anger. I just felt profound, exhausting pity. I will not pay for this house. I will not give you cash. The Oak Park era is over. She sank to the floor, weeping loudly, realizing her final manipulation had failed. I let her cry for a full minute before I unclasped my purse. Here is what I am willing to do, I said, my tone shifting to pure business. I pulled a thick, crisp white envelope from my bag and tossed it onto the nearest box. I had my corporate attorney, David Kensington, draft a very specific lease agreement. I have rented a one-bedroom apartment for you in a modest, secure, senior living community in Naperville. The rent is paid in full for the next 3 years. I have also arranged for a moving company to arrive tomorrow at 8 a.m. to take your remaining boxes. She looked up, sniffling, her face streaked with mascara. Naperville? But it's so small. All my friends from the country club are here in Oak Park. You don't have country club money anymore, Mum, I replied coldly. Beggars cannot be choosers. Listen to me very carefully. The lease is strictly in my name, managed through a shell LLC. You cannot borrow against it. You cannot sublet it. Furthermore, Weston is legally barred from entering the premises. If he ever shows up, or if Aunt Clara reports that you have tried to send him a single dime of the grocery stipend I am setting up, David Kensington will terminate the lease immediately, and you will be completely on the street. Do you understand me? She stared at the envelope, then back at my face. The fight had entirely left her. She was a broken woman who finally understood that the daughter she threw away was her only remaining lifeline. And that lifeline came with titanium boundaries. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't thank me," I said, turning my back to her and walking toward the door. "This isn't out of love. This is the bare minimum of biological obligation. I will not be visiting you, Mum. Aunt Clara will handle your check-ins from now on." I walked out of the house for the final time. I didn't look back at the peeling paint or the overgrown lawn. I got into my rental car, started the engine, and drove straight to O'Hare. A few days later, the chaos of Illinois felt like a distant nightmare. I was back in Austin. Harrison and I were sitting on the cedar patio of our home, looking out over the water as the Texas sun set, painting the wide sky in brilliant strokes of gold, crimson, and violet. He reached over and took my hand, his thumb gently tracing my knuckles. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly, knowing the weight of what I had just done. I took a slow sip of my red wine, letting the warm, fragrant evening breeze wash over my face. The heavy, suffocating weight that I had carried since childhood, the desperate, gnawing need to be seen, to be valued, to be enough for people who were committed to misunderstanding me, was finally, permanently gone. I had faced the ghost, and it had no power over me anymore. I leaned my head against Harrison's shoulder and smiled. I feel free. My parents gave everything to a phantom, leaving me to build a foundation from nothing. But in severing those toxic ties, I didn't lose my family. I finally found myself. I am no longer the glass child waiting in the shadows of someone else's disastrous mistakes. The beautiful life I built is mine alone. Blood may be thicker than water, but peace is far more precious. My story is mine.